It was the beginning of time, and the earth was without form. Into the void flowed the molten rock that gave it substance. The planet was transformed again and again by a cycle of creation and destruction that would span millions of years. On the northern half of one continent, a new land emerged, a land blessed with beauty on a scale like nowhere else on Earth, a land that would be known as Canada. In the Badlands of Alberta, there is a window into a time when the planet was young. The Badlands are a graveyard. Locked in the rock is a treasure trove that has lured paleontologists for more than a century. 65 to 85 million years ago, the landscape was very different from what it is today. What is now landlocked southern Alberta was once a coastal plain. It sat on the shore of a great sea that stretched from the Arctic down to the Gulf of Mexico. The climate was tropical, hot, wet, and humid. The vegetation was rich and lush. Life flourished, and so did the great beasts known as dinosaurs. In fact, almost 10% of all the species of dinosaurs ever discovered were found here. These are reputed to be the largest dinosaur bone beds in existence. There are more complete dinosaur skeletons from this region than any other area of this size in the world. The cause of the great dinosaur extinction is still a mystery. The most accepted theory is that a giant meteor struck Earth and caused a severe change in climate. Canada would never be as warm again, and now it was about to be transformed by ice. High up in Jasper National Park stands the last remnant of the great glaciers that once covered half of North America. In some parts of Canada, the ice was over 3 kilometers thick. Even today, the ice fields remain a spectacular sight and offer a hint of the size and power that once reshaped a continent. Ice, wind, and water ground down ancient mountains, carved out river valleys and gorges, created rolling hills and vast plains, and dotted the landscape with lakes and wetlands. When the ice retreated, new plants and animals emerged in lush forests and fertile valleys. Even in the most inhospitable regions of this new land, life found ways to put down roots. In the far northern reaches, hundreds of kilometers north of the tree line, seemingly delicate plants defy the isolation and survive. The new domain was rich and diverse, and a whole new array of creatures appeared on the virgin landscape. During the last ice age, so much water was locked up in the great glaciers that sea levels were about 125 meters lower than they are today. This exposed the continental shelf, and Asia and the Americas were, for a time, linked by a subcontinent called Beringia. Both animals and humans moved across this ancient land bridge into the New World. The old Crow Flats in the Yukon are a remnant of that bridge. The landscape here remains much as it was 30,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found remnants of some of the giant creatures who once roamed here. Mammoths, bison, muskox, and enormous 200-kilogram beavers. There is evidence that suggests the first human presence in North America was at Old Crow Flats. A new species, man, had come to North America. The Thule people, whose predecessors crossed the Great Land Bridge and are the ancestors of the modern Inuit, began to spread east from Alaska about 1,000 years ago. Following the ancient migration routes of the caribou and muskox, they trekked across what is now the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. 500 kilometers to the east at Tuktuk Nogai, the ruins of their living quarters and food caches are still evident today. Evidence of the Thule is even found 700 kilometers from the North Pole. On the most northern reaches of Ellesmere Island, Thule hunters piled rocks to build a hunting blind where they would hide and wait for passing muskox. They called this small patch of land Kiguktaru. It sits in the Beaufort Sea, just off the northern shore of the Yukon. According to Inuit oral tradition, there were people here to witness the creation of this island. The Thule built wooden houses on this treeless island from timber washed out to sea by the Mackenzie River. They were masters of the kayak and harpoon and lived on what the sea provided. The waters around this island offered a rich bounty of seals, as well as bowhead and beluga whales. early European explorers would name it Herschel Island. The first ships of the American whaling companies arrived in Pauline Cove in 1890. The whalers built their headquarters, processing plants, and a trading post on shore. The Inuit prospered by their association with the whalers, but they also suffered from the ravages of liquor and the white man's diseases. Every summer, Inuit elders come here to practice traditional ways and pass their skills on to the younger generation. When residential schools were introduced in the 1940s, native culture was all but lost. Recently, a program called Elder Host is helping reclaim it.
We tell them stories about hunting and trapping. Like in the fall time, when I was growing up, my grandfather used to take us out caribou hunting and make sure we have enough meat for the winter. And I used to wonder, why is he doing that? There's caribou all the time. And here he tell us that when the snow get deep, and in the winter time, the caribou goes away somewhere else. So we have to get it before it's too late.
Like this.
The opportunity to celebrate their heritage is also what draws Native peoples to this refuge in the heart of the Canadian prairies. They gather here from almost every corner of the continent, as they've done for 5,000 years. In Saskatchewan, wheat fields carpet the landscape that was once vast plains of grasslands and the ancestral territories of the great Cree nations. This flat, featureless landscape is broken occasionally by rolling hills and river valleys. One such valley is near Saskatoon, where Ippewa Creek runs into the South Saskatchewan River. The valley provides shelter for a variety of living things, a haven from the harsh prairie wind, the winter cold, and summer heat. This is Wanaskewin, a Cree word which means gathering place. It sits at the heart of the Cree culture and history. Archaeologists have uncovered 19 ancient sites in a dig area that is only 1 kilometer square. The excavation reveals different levels that take them back through time, a sort of archaeological layer cake.
In the top uppermost layer, this is the sod layer. You can see there's lots of roots from the watered vegetation up here. There are artifacts found right in the sod, so you don't have to go very deep. There's a piece of bone right in the sod layer. And this level has some historic artifacts, some metal pieces and metal projectile points, some trade beads, so we know that it's around the time of contact. Once we are into 5A and 5B, we're on the order of 3,500 to 4,000 years ago.
For the Cree, it's a living legacy to be celebrated with song, potlatches, sun dances, and sweat lodges. No other North American mammal migrates as far, in such complex patterns, or in such numbers as the caribou. Twice a year, the caribou migrate across the territory of the Vuntut Gwich'in in the northern Yukon. For countless generations, the caribou have been a source of food, clothing, and shelter for the Gwich'in. In the time before the gun was introduced, the Gwich'in used a simple but ingenious method to hunt their prey. On the edge of the tree line, the Gwich'in built crude fences to corral the caribou.
The fence, first it started way on a mountain, it come like this. So it started a wide place like this, and then it narrows right down. You could see that it comes in there, and in there they got some things coming out like this, where they got snares made out of caribou skin, and that's where they catch all the caribou. And in there they use spears and bow and arrow. And as soon as the caribou would die, they take it out right away. So that's how they used it, so that they can survive, so that the kids can eat.
In a rare visit, the elders of the current Gwich'in tribe have traveled to this remote spot to admire their ancestors' ingenuity. Their forefathers worked long and hard to erect 5 kilometers of fencing along the Great Migration Way of the caribou. Five centuries before Christopher Columbus made his celebrated voyage to North America, the Vikings established a small settlement on the northern reaches of Newfoundland, today called L'Anse aux Meadows. At the end of the first millennium, the Vikings were seafaring explorers who saw the Atlantic Ocean as one massive lake surrounded by land. Although they were bold and often sailed into uncharted waters, the Vikings' arrival in North America may have remained a secret. But scholars began to study the Norse sagas, a detailed record of the adventures of Eric the Red and his son Leif Erikson as they explored the shores of Iceland and Greenland, and a land to the west that they called Vinland. For centuries, historians have tried to determine the precise location of Vinland, theorizing that it lay anywhere from the state of Maine to the shores of Baffin Island. But the discovery of a 16th century mariner's map shows Vinlandia clearly marked on a large peninsula. In the 1960s, attention focused on the northern tip of Newfoundland, along the Strait of Belle Isle. For generations, locals were aware of ancient ruins on a nearby terrace that commanded a good view of the sea. Archaeological excavations soon revealed evidence of a well-established community, several buildings, a kiln, a smelting pit, and piles of slag. Clearly, the inhabitants of this settlement had built a permanent shelter and had the means to repair their ships. But absolute proof that this was a Viking settlement did not come until the discovery in 1968 of a seemingly insignificant bronze pin. The pin was traceable to Norse settlements in Ireland and Scotland and dated to the 10th and 11th centuries. To convey a sense of Viking life, Parks Canada established an interpretive program at L'Anse aux Meadows that included the construction of 3 replica houses on the original site. The remains of 8 of the original buildings are clearly visible as a series of grassy mounds. Life 1,000 years ago for the Norsemen was simple and crude. Despite the harsh conditions, they had ample food to sustain them over the winter. Evidence indicates that Viking women were part of these early settlements. Life expectancy was short, as death from childbirth and disease took its toll. Women spent much of their time inside poorly ventilated huts, cooking over open fires, or sewing by the light of the fire. As a result, many suffered respiratory difficulties and illnesses. The Vikings weren't the only visitors to this remote part of Newfoundland. Aboriginals lived here at various times before, during, and after the arrival of the Norsemen. At first, both parties traded food and furs. After a few seasons, their encounters grew more hostile, forcing the small Viking band to eventually abandon their settlement and sail back to Greenland, never to return. They left behind enough evidence to confirm that they'd been to L'Anse aux Meadows. To date, it is the only authenticated Viking site in North America. The discovery of the New World in the name of Crown and Country would begin centuries after the Vikings, with Christopher Columbus's epic voyage and the adventures of John Cabot and Samuel de Champlain. At about the same time as Champlain was beginning to chart the waters of the Great St. Lawrence, visitors from another foreign shore were voyaging to the barren coast of what is now Labrador, not to claim sovereignty, but to establish a very successful commercial enterprise. In the late 16th century, the Basque whalers sought whale oil to light the lamps of Europe. To the Basque, whale oil was liquid gold. The Basques came and settled for the 5-month summer hunting season. At one settlement at Red Bay, they left behind the remnants of their whaling stations. Here, whales were cut into small pieces and rendered into oil. Stone ovens once held the massive copper cauldrons used for boiling the blubber. As many as 2,000 Basque sailors, men and boys, worked the whaling stations. Life in the settlements was harsh. Separated from family and loved ones for 6 months each year, the whalers worked long days in one of the most unpredictable environments in the world. The danger came in hunting the whales at sea. Skill and courage were required to chase them down, deliver the harpoon, and bring the carcasses to shore. Many lives were lost. Historical evidence indicates that after about 40 years of intensive whaling, with up to 20 ships each year, the whales had almost been wiped out. In the early part of the 17th century, the Basques stopped coming to Red Bay. The Basques would have encountered the first French explorers who gave way to the first colonists. France was determined to settle the New World. They laid claim to the lands along the mighty waterway, the St. Lawrence, and carved out new settlements out of the wilderness on the Great Lakes. Quebec, on the St. Lawrence, would control trade and movement up and down the Great Waterway.
At the time, the St. Lawrence River is really the main way to get inside the country, and by controlling Quebec City, and you can see the cliffs here are quite magnificent and easy to defend. So it's also the place where the river narrows, so it's easy to control, so it has a lot of importance militarily. Strategically, this is the place where you can stop an invasion from going any further up the river to get to Montreal, for instance, or to the Great Lakes.
France's great rival in this struggle for a continent was Britain, and the two sides were determined to control the strategic high ground. For the ordinary foot soldier on either side, that meant terror and danger. We can get a sense of the soldier's life in early Canada thanks to the remarkable passion of modern-day recreationists who regularly convene from all over the continent to reenact historic battles on the Plains of Abraham outside the walls of old Quebec City. Battle strategy in the 18th century was quite different than modern warfare. The British soldiers were particularly expert in this style of battle, in which men marched across the battlefield as if they were on a parade square.
Usually you have to imagine this is a big chess game. You're trying to find where the enemy is, you're trying to outmaneuver the enemy, you're trying to take the best position possible. So it could take days actually to set a battle before the enemies actually come at one another. Once the battle starts, there's no telling if it's going to last an hour or if it's going to last, the whole day. It depends on all the skirmishing actions and how people get in contact and how the troops react.
To move troops, officers used drummers to convey their orders over the roar of the battle.
Basically, the drums are the signal corps of the Army. Some of the signals that you hear if you watch one of our battles, the first would be the signals for the soldiers actually to load their muskets and get ready to fire. So the officer commanding would say, "Prime and load." Then the next command will be "Make ready," "Present," "Fire." And then the sequence begins again.
The drums were simple and effective devices, but the same could not be said of the guns. Although capable of doing terrible physical damage, the musket was not a very precise weapon, and it rarely hit what it was aimed at. That's why battles tended to be masses of men firing simultaneously at other masses of men.
The musket itself is extremely inaccurate. It might be able to hit someone at 70 or 80 yards, but not the someone you were shooting at.
In between battles, life for an 18th century soldier did offer some comforts, since armies were mobile communities. There were women to cook and clean for the men. Some were wives, others were camp followers who simply tagged along, often because their homes had been destroyed by war. "2,000 kilometers inland from Quebec City, explorers were pushing deeper into the wilderness. On the north shore of Lake Superior, Fort William was built. It was a settlement founded on a fashion trend. Beaver fur-lined hats had become all the rage in Europe, and there was a fortune to be made by meeting the soaring demand. Since 1670, the Hudson's Bay Company had held a lucrative monopoly in the fur trade, thanks in part to its network of trading posts along the shores of Hudson's Bay. In the early 1800s, that monopoly was challenged by the rival Northwest Company. The upstarts charted new inland trade routes. Fort William was a vital link on that route and a key destination for the legendary voyageurs. At the height of its success, the Northwest Company had 1,100 of these compact iron men on its payroll. They were hand-picked for their short stature and enormous strength. Their average height was 5 feet, 5 inches. This left plenty of room in the canoes for the valuable cargo.
The canoe itself weighs about 600 pounds, so they'd have to stop and carry that. A minimum of 33 times between Montreal and here, plus the 4 tons of cargo. The record from Montreal to here was about 19 days. That's 1,200 miles of paddling in a canoe carrying all of that gear, so it's pretty amazing. And they were very proud of themselves.
The voyageurs also had to contend with hordes of black flies and clouds of mosquitoes. Each voyageur needed to consume 6,500 calories a day to sustain the enormous physical effort. Many of those calories came from cornmeal and salt pork boiled into a thick soup.
Men describe trying to bring food into their mouth and getting a good scoop of corn and grease, but it being covered in black flies and mosquitoes at the same time.
Although the voyageurs were often treated badly by their overseers, that did not deter them from taking up the rugged life of the canoe brigades. And their output was impressive. Thanks to the efforts of the voyageurs, in a typical year, the fur tally for the Northwest Company included the skins of 2,000 bears, 3,800 wolves, 4,600 otters, 17,000 muskrats, 32,000 marten, and 5,500 foxes. And a staggering 20,000 beaver pelts were shipped out in a single year. The Satu Dene call Great Bear Lake their freezer. They have been fishing this vast lake for 5 millennia.
Gotta go, guys.
Today, nylon nets and snowmobiles have replaced ancient willow bark nets and dog teams. But the basic techniques and the exact fishing locations haven't changed. For centuries, the Satu Dene were nomadic. They moved from camp to camp, following the caribou and establishing fishing settlements along the lakeshore. But in the winter, the ice on Great Bear Lake can be as much as 2 feet thick, except near the mouth of the Great Bear River. Here, the moving water keeps the ice thin, and the river stays open in places. This natural blessing gave the Dene the means to survive the ferocious winters. They call the site Delaney, the word for ancestral winter fishery. Today, Delaney is a community of 600, and the Dene have been forced to give up their nomadic ways. The Dene hold a strong belief in the sharing of resources. It's a tradition that Sir John Franklin was grateful for during his second Arctic expedition of 1826. When Franklin arrived at Great Bear Lake, the community risked its own food supply to ensure that the newcomers would survive. Since the time of Franklin, the Dene have learned to adapt and try to accept the influence of the white man. But their rich traditions and way of life are as important today as they were when their ancestors first became the people of the Great Bear. The opening up of the land by explorers and traders made way for settlers and lumbermen. They came to reap the bounty of the great forests of Lower and Upper Canada. They cleared the land and planted and harvested their crops, bringing stability and permanence. It was a pattern that spread from the Atlantic coast through Quebec and Ontario, and on to the great expanses of the prairies that would become Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Life was harsh, but perseverance, faith, and a strong back brought simple comforts and the rewards of building a new life in a bountiful land. On the other side of the continent, the dreams of one group of homesteaders would have a tragic outcome. The northwestern tip of Vancouver Island is a mariner's nightmare. The shoreline is rugged, and the weather can turn dangerous almost in an instant. Sun and sea are often blotted out by mist and fog, and man's handiwork is swallowed quickly by the encroaching forest. Sea stacks and caves dot a coastline of impassable shoals and soaring cliffs, features which reinforce its isolation and protect its unspoiled beauty. It's no wonder that this area held little attraction for settlers in the 19th century. It was too rugged, too hard to reach, and too wet. But with provincial land grants in hand, a group of Danes from the American Midwest rose to the challenge and arrived at Cape Scott in 1897.
This meadow, now known as Hanson's Lagoon, was one of the key features which drew the Danes to this area. To establish this land, they needed to build the dikes to protect it from the high tides of the winter months, which basically come right over this area. The creation of the dike did, in fact, establish a lot more farmland. Each man who worked on the dike was allotted a certain parcel of this land.
When the first dike was completed, there was a celebration, but it proved to be premature. An unusually high tide rolled in and completely washed away 3 years of hard work. They had to start all over again. They built a second dike, higher and in a better location. It was a constant battle to keep the sea and wilderness at bay. The community was a small, hard-working group of about 100 people, and for almost a decade, they had hope. The tamed land was fertile and bountiful. Crop yields were high, and the quality was good. The Danes built nearly 20 kilometers of corduroy road within their colony. Log after log was laid by hand over the forest floor. But none of their roads connected to the outside world. They had no way to get their produce to market. The road that the government had promised them was never built. It was a betrayal that would doom the community. The Danish colony was abandoned in 1907, just 10 years after it was established. Life along the Labrador coast is as harsh and isolated as the landscape. For almost 2 centuries, a thinly spread population of 30,000 people have manned a string of outports and fishing stations. In the 1770s, the John Slade Company, a fishing enterprise based in the English seaport of Poole, made Battle Harbor its Labrador headquarters, or station. It offered access to the Grand Banks, one of the richest fishing grounds in the world, and eventually Battle Harbor became a year-round settlement. The fishermen married Inuit and Métis women, and these first families became known as the Livyers of Labrador, wresting a meager living from a hostile sea. Most fishermen and their families lived in abject poverty, and disease ran almost unchecked through their ranks. Livyer families nursed their sick as best they could, but the death rate from illness, accident, and childbirth was high. However, in 1892, everything changed for the families of Battle Harbor. A British missionary doctor named Wilfred Grenfell stepped ashore for the first time, and he was horrified by what he saw. Battle Harbor needed a hospital, and Grenfell persuaded the merchants to donate a building. To the joy of the Livyers, Battle Harbor Hospital opened in 1893. It was Labrador's first medical facility. Dr. Grenfell also knew the Labrador Livyers needed more than a hospital. He built a children's orphanage in nearby St. Anthony's, Newfoundland. He opened a school on the coast and started up nursing stations in isolated communities. He even launched a fishermen's cooperative to challenge the monopoly of the merchant barons. Grenfell died in 1940 at the age of 75. Today, his schools and medical centers along the Labrador coast are government-run. Throughout Labrador, Wilfrid Grenfell is well remembered and still considered the best-loved man on the coast. This ordinary loft above the salt store is perhaps the most historic room at Battle Harbour. In 1909, it was the unlikely setting for one of the 20th century's most dramatic press conferences. 30 journalists from across North America crowded into the loft to hear famed Arctic explorer Robert E. Peary announced that he had reached the North Pole. Peary rudely dismissed his arch rival, Dr. Frederick Cook, who earlier had claimed to have been there first. Battle Harbour had Labrador's first Marconi radio station. Returning from his conquest of the North Pole, Battle Harbour would have been Peary's first opportunity to speak directly to the world and discredit Cook. Ironically, Peary may not have even made it to the pole himself. Modern scientists have suggested that Peary's crude method of dead reckoning to determine his final position was probably inaccurate. Today, visitors who come to Battle Harbour can admire the humpback whales surfacing in the calm waters of the island's Tickle. And they can explore the picturesque village that has become a living museum. This small island in the St. Lawrence River entered Canadian history with a noble purpose and left a legacy of horror. In 1832, the British government opened a quarantine station on Gros Isle, 48 kilometers downstream from Quebec City. It was a checkpoint for the waves of arriving immigrants and was designed to stop diseases like cholera and typhus from reaching the mainland. It was built to accommodate 200 in its hospital and another 800 people in its quarantine shelters. And for 15 years, it served its purpose adequately. But by 1846, 2 years of potato crop failure in Ireland forced thousands of sick and desperate immigrants to make the arduous journey to Canada. For more than 6 weeks, they were squeezed into squalid compartments aboard ships. They had no fresh air or light, little food, and no fresh water. The ship's holds became breeding grounds for disease. In the first weeks of the 1847 shipping season, Gros Isle's facilities were overwhelmed. By June, the situation was desperate. 15,000 people were now quarantined on the island. 2,000 of them were sick and crammed into overburdened facilities. There were as many as 86 deaths a day. By the end of the sailing season, almost 100,000 Irish immigrants had been quarantined on Gros Isle. 5,000 of them would never leave. The Irish famine ended a year later, and never again would Gros Isle see such horror. But the summer of 1847 would never be forgotten. The Grand River flows through southern Ontario. For the Iroquois people, it became the center of their worldly and spiritual lives. their descendants have recreated a traditional village along the banks of the Grand River, a village they call Kanata.
Kanata is the Mohawk word for village. And what we have here is an early 1600 Iroquois village, a place where we come to gather up the resources so that we would have abundance for the winter. We would follow those rivers. We would make this journey to the areas that were known to our people, especially the Grand River. That's why it's called the Grand, because it was magnificent.
The history of the Iroquois people was forged in war and by the vision of its legendary chief, Joseph Brant. Brant was the celebrated leader of the Six Nations Confederacy when Britain and 13 of her colonies went to war. The Iroquois Confederacy was an alliance of the Mohawks, the Cayugas, the Onondagas, the Tuscaroras, the Senecas, and the Oneidas. They shared an advanced and sophisticated form of government. Legend has it that George Washington looked on the Iroquois Confederacy as a model for the new republic he was helping create. Most of the Iroquois fought for the British during the American Revolution. As a reward for their loyalty, the king granted them the land of their choice. Brant chose a swath 10 kilometers wide that spanned the entire length of the Grand River. This became the land of the Six Nations. Brant also encouraged non-natives to settle along the shores of the river. He leased or sold them parcels of land. Almost all settlements strung along the Grand River today can be traced back to Joseph Brant's original land grant. For the First Nations people, their relationship with the land was a celebration of harmony. For the newcomers, the land represented freedom and sanctuary from tyranny. Together, they share a magnificent journey, a journey still unfolding before us in a land called Canada.